Thank you all for attending to this presentation. Today, I'm going to talk about the use of artificial intelligence to process nuclear scattering energy spectra. This is a collaborative work between my group in the Institute of Physics of University of São Paulo and the Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics. I'm sure you have heard about the global initiative and pursuing the production of clean energy by nuclear fusion reaction of light nuclei. By clean, I mean free of emission of CO2. This is very important to the mankind, mostly in the last decade, because the global warming is becoming an issue, and something has to be done to fulfill the future necessities for electricity production. There is indeed a project to construct the first demonstration power plant, and this is going to be done based on the design parameters of the JET reactor, which is a very big nuclear reactor, fusion reactor located in England, and in data obtained in ITER, which is the even bigger nuclear reactor that's under construction in France. This is scientific research that demands outcomes from many different scientific areas. And one that's important for this presentation here is the interaction between the plasma and the surface of the internal walls of the reactor. In this picture, what you see is the internal view of the vessel in the jet reactor. This is a very nice picture because on the left you see an image by optical image. You see how the chamber is from the inside. But on the right, what you see is a special camera that takes the infrared produced when the plasma hits the surface, the internal walls of the reactor. And this is one of the reasons why the interaction between the plasma and the surface of the material is important, because there is a lot of constraints for this material to handle all the power that is produced in the plasma. Just like the sun, the energy will be produced by the fusion of light nuclei, and it may be the case that some instability makes the plasma components, the ions or electrons that are produced, are contained in the plasma, hits the surface as here. This is indeed a very important part of the reactor. This is called a diverter, and this is important because most of the ions that are contaminating the plasma are directed to this region. So this is the part of the reactor that has the most stringent constraint, mostly because of the power load that is deposited on top of this. The Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics is it's a gigantic institute in this field, producing lots of technology in the reactor and theoretical studies, and also in the interface and the plasma surface interaction studies. One thing that's important, and for this presentation is even more important, is the sputtering rates that that produces the removal or the erosion of materials in the diverter or in any other part of the reactor, and brings this material to the plasma, and then it's redeposited in other parts of the machine. This makes the study of the plasma wall interaction even more important. One thing that eventually you have not heard about is that all these reactor that I mentioned are based on the tokamak philosophy, but there is another philosophy that's also being explored in the Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics, which is the stellarator. This also, in this reactor, the plasma is confined also in a toroid, magnetic toroid, but this toroid is twisted, just like in this picture over here. In this case, we have many divertors spread all over the plasma confinement region, and some studies has to be done about the interface interaction between the plasma and the materials. This presentation concerns about the study of the interaction between the plasma and the divertor. So here is one tile that composes the divertor that's shown here. You see in this picture on the right, this tile removed, and you see the marks of the produced by the plasma interaction, basically removing material from this. So we have to study this to understand how is the dynamic of operation of the reactor, what is the stability, and how the plasma interacts with the surface, and how it's done. Basically, producing special tiles containing molybdenum marker layer. So it's made out of a bulk of carbon. You have a very thin film of molybdenum on top of it, and on top of it all, we have a thicker layer of carbon. The carbon layer is between 5 and 10 micrometers. It's a large deposit, so it's hard to keep it homogeneous. So we have to measure this at some point. But after the plasma exposure, what is expected is that the plasma removes part of the carbon film or deposits some other materials provenient from different parts of the reactor. And how this is measured? How can we study plasma surface interaction by means of this layered system? Basically using Rutherford Backscattering Spectrometry. In this case, you see the energy spectra of protons scattered by a system like this. Just a crash course on Rutherford Backscattering Spectrometry. The thickness of the first carbon layer is deduced from this width over here. The thickness of the molybdenum film is taken either by this thickness or this height, depending on the resolution, and also on this width. Because this depression in the carbon signal is actually because of the presence of this molybdenum film, right? So in this part of the spectra, you see protons scattered deep in the bulk of the carbon. So basically, what we have to do is to measure the thickness of this layer system prior to plasma exposure and after the plasma exposure, and then take some conclusions about the heating point of the plasma and so on. This is easier said than done, just because the tile is very big, and then we have many spots to analyze. Actually, in this presentation that in this presentation, we had 500 spectra of the samples prior to plasma exposure and 2,400 spectra after the plasma exposure. And this is indeed demanding, because the interpretation of Rutherford Backscattering spectra is somehow depending on the expertise of the analyst. You need a human input to decide what is the best configuration for the sample description. Basically, in the literature, this method is known as inverse multi-Carroll process, where you make some assumption about the layer structure, and then you do a simulation and compare the result of the simulation with the experimental data. If the simulation does not agree, then you modify your prior knowledge, your priors about the sample description until the thing converge. So this process is the typical process that is done, and it takes time and requires human resources. In fact, this is there is another reason for this to be challenged, and I'm trying to explain this on this slide. Basically, you can divide the category of the analysis, the kind of analysis that you can do using IBA, using ion beam analysis, in two different categories. The first one is the ones that you have a very small number of samples, and these samples are very important, they are very special, they are unique, and then you want to characterize them as best as you can. So we insert the samples into the accelerator, then we perform different measurements with the different energies using different probes, placing the detector on different angles, and so on. And you do this until we can solve all the ambiguities and get the most of the accuracy that we can get from ion beam analysis. But there is still another category where the number of samples is important. Actually, the information is not actually in the characteristics of the sample itself, but it's actually in the variety and diversity of the samples. The information that we are pursuing is actually the variance and covariance between the samples. So in this case, what we want to do is to measure as much as you can. So we want to perform as much measurements as possible, so we have a good statistics to represent the variance of the sample set. The thing is that ion beam analysis performs very well in category A. Even there are some works that report that in some conditions, Rutherford Backscattering can be considered as a primary standard, achieving accuracies of the order of 1%. Very special conditions, but this is possible in some of them. But it does not perform so well in category B just because it takes too much time to perform the analysis of the spectrum. So the point is that the research that I'm developing in a few years already is how to transfer all the capacity that we have to analyze samples in category A to category B. For this, what I can report is our effort in maintaining the software multi-sim array. It's a collaborative work also between my group and the Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics. We developed this multi-sim array software that can handle multiple spectra of the same samples. And because of this, we were able to participate on this collaboration where we did the analysis of 300 samples. In which each sample had 6 spectra, and all of them had to be processed self-consistently. So not just we have to increase our capacity to analyze the data because we are interested on these category B samples, but also because increasing the capacity of data processing enable us to participate in different collaborations and also increase the impact of our research. But still, even with this capacity, 300 samples are still a small number compared to the number of spectra that we have to process to solve this problem on the fusion reactor. And how we ended up in this collaboration. It's because we are in the Laboratory for Material Analysis with Ion Beams, LAMFI, it's acronyms to the Portuguese words. We are developing a layer structure, a data processing layer, which is supposed to run on the cloud, that's going to process or at least pre-process most of the data that's produced in our laboratory. We started with the KAS, which is the Data Quality Assurance System, which is going to process accelerator data to produce certificates of quality of the data produced in the laboratory. But for this work, what we are interested in this simpler spectral processing system, which is a system that is intended to feature some artificial neural network to do the processing of some samples. I will give an example. In our laboratory, what we receive is from different laboratories, different research groups that are interested in studying solar cells, lots of zinc oxide films. So in this sense, this basic structure could be trained, could have an artificial neural network trained, so this simple sample could be processed automatically in our cloud system. And this is the main reason for us to participate in this collaboration, because we are interested in speeding up the process of data analysis of ion beam analysis. So this is the basic architecture of this SSPS system. So we have a Python wrapper that is multi-threading the simulation software to produce the training set based on simulation. It's training set of, it's a data set used for training the artificial neural network. It produces also the validation set. Then it goes to a layer structure that introduces noise and scaling for the artificial neural network. And this process is fed by the spectra contained in our database. After some validation of the neural network using memorization error, validation error, and generalization error, then the neural network is used in production to predict the characteristics of the samples that this neural network was trained. What it did is actually to test this as SPS system using the data from the W7X, which is the nuclear, the fusion reactor that I showed a few slides ago. So in this presentation, I'm going to present just the samples that were not exposed to the plasma, just because what we want to show here is how this artificial neural network performs in these conditions. The exposed samples have a very complex spectra, and it will be presented in the future, hopefully. So what you can see here is this RBS spectra on different spots of this tile. Then you see that molybdenum signal reduces some of the samples, even present no molybdenum signal at all. And the carbon layer also have a strong variation. So this is indeed a challenging problem to artificial neural network, because some problems can be reduced to a linear system, and then artificial neural network performance is amazing. But in this case, what we have is that varying the thickness of the carbon layer, also varying the position of the molybdenum signal and the position of this depression. Thinner carbon films produce a molybdenum signal more advanced in this spectra, and the depression also more advanced. So in this sense, the output of this analysis are not just nonlinear, but also highly correlated. Additional difficulties are coming from the roughness of the layer structure, which also introduces some broadening of the spectra, as I'm going to show in a few slides. So now I'm going to show our first approach, which is training one network to predict the layer structure based on a training set that does not include the roughness of the sample. So this was used as a proof of concept that the neural network could be used to process this spectra. What you see here is actually a comparison between the predictions done by artificial neural networks in the y-axis with the manual evaluation done by a student from the Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics. So what we can conclude from this is that if they would agree, the points would lie on top of this line over here, which is the symmetrical line. But in fact, what we see is that the artificial neural network is predicting systematically less carbon than the manual evaluation. The same thing is observed for molybdenum. And basically, this is because the system does not take into account the roughness of the sample. So here I show you a comparison for us to understand what's going on. Here's a comparison between the human performance and the computer performance. Here is the fit done by the student. This is the manual fit, and this is the fit performed by the artificial neural network. We see many differences, and mostly because the roughness was not predicted. If you take this value of roughness that was fitted by the student and we include in this model, then what you see is a much better agreement, but there is still a misalignment between the molybdenum signal and this depression here, showing that we have to improve the model to a better agreement between experimental and simulation. Now the second approach, we include the roughness, and this takes much more time to produce a training set because the roughness is simulated by a Monte Carlo method. So This increases considerably the CPU time, but it is still feasible to do. What we see here is a much better agreement, but there is still a bias between the neural network evaluation and the manual evaluation. The carbon thickness is much better now, but now what we see is that the artificial neural network is predicting systematically higher values than the manual evaluation. To molybdenum, this effect is even higher, but well, it is still predicting, right? So now it raises the question: who is right, the artificial neural network or the student? This is a very good question to do. What we did to understand better what's the reason of this bias is to perform the automatic fit using conventional algorithms for this. So it took a lot of computational time to fit all these samples using the simplex method. It took something like 1 month of CPU time or something like that. But what we see is that there is a much better agreement between the artificial neural network and the fit using the batch mode. So eventually the question that may rise for you now is, why should we be concerned about neural network if we can do the conventional fit, right? But the point is that with the artificial neural network, we spent something like 1 week of CPU time, while the conventional fit it took something like 1 month of CPU time. So in this sense, this serves as a proof of concept that artificial neural network can be used to process RBS data. And just to show a comparison now between humans and computers, we see that there is a much better agreement between the artificial neural network prediction and experimental data. Now we want to answer the question which one we should pick, right? And the question is that the answer for this question is that artificial neural network predicts values that result in a much smaller chi-square than a manual fit. So the artificial neural network in this case performs better than human evaluation and much faster too. So just to end my presentation here, I show the final conclusion of this data and showing the thickness of the carbon layer as a function of the position on the divertor tile. You see that in this region there is a good agreement between the white dots that are samples before the plasma exposure and the black dots that are after the plasma exposure. And then at some point, the carbon thickness has a strong reduction, even being vanished in this region over here. And the molybdenum signal is more or less spread on this region, but they agree on samples prior and after a plasma exposure. And in the same region over here, you see a depression of the molybdenum signal, indicating that in this region over here, the plasma is not just removing all the carbon layer, but it's also removing a significant part of the molybdenum layer. What we can do is to use the sputtering, the differences between the sputtering rates, and then make an estimate of what would be the material removed from the tile if it was completely produced by using carbon, right? And that's what is shown in this region, in this graph over here, including the uncertainties that are reported in the literature. So what I want to show you here is that for the samples prior to the plasma exposure, we have evaluations for using the artificial neural networks, the manual evaluation, and also the fit in batch mode. But for the samples after the plasma exposure, we have only the ANN, mostly because of the response time. So we are indeed able to speed up the analysis, and then we could provide not a prompt yet, but a faster feedback to next campaign of the reactor. So as a conclusion, artificial neural networks have been successful in processing the W7X data. The SSPS system that is under construction in length had the concept proved with this data. And machine learning can work as an assistant to speed up processing of ion beam analysis data, enabling us to produce a much faster response or to produce a much larger evaluation of a much larger set of samples. So I want to acknowledge the support done by the Brazilian funding agency. It was also supported by a project in the University of São Paulo to promote the use of intelligent systems in the laboratory, and to Instituto Nacional de Ciência e Tecnologia, Física Nuclear e Aplicações, that gave us support on a fellowship to a student. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tiago, for your presentation. So let's see if we have some questions in the chat. We don't have any questions here. So let's open for questions. If someone wants to write in the chat or open the can open the microphone. So questions. I see, Tiago, I have a question that this problem of the people from plasma physics was the start, but this methodology that you are developing is useful for many other applications of Rutherford backscattering. Or
in principle, yes.
I mean, if you develop a neural network or a neural system to solve this problem, should it be trained for each type of sample that you have, or if you make a training and it's valid for a lot of problems?
Not actually. This artificial neural network that we trained is valid only for this specific system of a carbon layered on top of molybdenum on top of a book of carbon. For each sample, we have to develop a training set and train the neural network from scratch.
Okay.
But in principle, our idea is to store a library of different artificial neural networks already trained, right, for a problem that frequently appears in our laboratory, then to trigger then using our previous knowledge about this sample. So.
Okay. Any other question? So thank you, Tiago.
Well, thank you.